I want to welcome our first guest of the evening to Loomer Unleashed, Audrey Tang, who I believe is joining us from Taiwan or perhaps still Europe, but I know it's somewhere overseas. So, Audrey, thank you so much for joining me on my program tonight. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm in Taiwan. It's 10:30, and really happy to share with you some thoughts around the freedom of speech. We, of course, support robust uncensored discourse from Taiwan because we suffer from martial law and also, of course, resisting authoritarian censorship.
Absolutely. So you are Taiwan's cyber ambassador, and you were also Taiwan's first ever digital affairs minister from 2022 to 2024. And I think it's an interesting concept because only now here in the United States do we have somebody who is fulfilling a similar role. I guess people would describe you as the tech support, right? The tech support for Taiwan. And now we see the same kind of position being filled by Elon Musk, and that he is, it's a self proclaimed position of White House tech support or national tech support. Can you explain to the viewers what you do in your position as Taiwan cyber ambassador and what your position as the digital affairs minister involves? Because I think that that's a unique position to Taiwan that we don't really see in other places around the world.
Certainly. So I joined the cabinet as a special advisor in 2014, actually. That was more than a decade ago. And it followed a event in Taiwan's history we call the Sunflower Movement in March 2014. At the time, many people who were unhappy with this trade deal with Beijing that would have invited them into our media, into our communication network, and so on, took the matter to our own hands. So we peacefully occupied Parliament for 3 weeks, calling for reform. And also we call ourselves demonstrators, not just protesters, because we want to show that it is possible in a way that is transparent, that's not censored, to have an all of society conversation around these matters. And so at the end of that year, I was invited to basically play that role, but online. And so building systems where people can have unfettered access and conversations without getting censored by social media at the time, big tech at the time, so that we can determine policies together. So we not only resolved issues, for example, around Uber and workers' rights and so on, but also we tackled the disinformation attack, the polarization attacks coming from our authoritarian neighbor. And we also shortened the text filing process from 3 hours into like 3 minutes. That was in 2016, 17, again, tapping into the wisdom of the crowd by anyone who contributes ideas. And we publish also transparently the government spendings, procurement, so that people can comment freely on it.
Very interesting. And of course, that's a position that I wish we would have had here in the United States of America years ago, because we've seen now finally there seems to be a focus on free speech. And especially now that we're seeing the political vindication of President Trump with his reelection after we witnessed the shocking censorship during a presidential election in 2020 and the shocking act of deplatforming of a sitting United States president by the big tech social media companies, of course, in 2021. So, I'd like to see that there's now a renewed focus on free speech and the creation of platforms. But I still think that there are challenges here, not just in Taiwan, not just in other parts of the world. We saw this discussed at length, and it became a point of controversy during the Munich Security Council, given the fact that J.D. Vance put most of the European attendees on full blast on the international stage there, condemning them by name for individual acts of censorship and authoritarianism. And I know that one of the things that you're most focused on, and you recently released a paper on this, and you have a film coming out about this as well, is a way that these social media platforms can help support communities through transparency and through open source technology as a way to combat not only censorship, but also authoritarianism. And so given that you not only attended the Munich Security Conference, but you also spoke on behalf of Taiwan. What were your thoughts of JD Vance's speech? What was the reaction as an attendee? How did you feel in your position as the cyber ambassador? And what impact do you think it had on the global stage as it relates to free speech and anti-censorship policies?
Yeah, great question. So I spoke at the Munich Cybersecurity Conference, which is one day before the security conference. But I did, of course, like everybody else, listened to your vice president's speech. I think in Taiwan, because we're the most free in all of Asia in terms of internet freedom, including freedom of expression and so on, we do not believe that there is a trade-off to be made between security on one side and freedom on the other. There's many jurisdictions that believe in order to have safety, have security, and so on, you have to give in a little bit on freedom, like you have to censor some speech in the name of safety and security. But in Taiwan, we have found that if you make sure that it is the communities themselves making the moderation work instead of delegating it into experts or some, third-party people controlled by big tech, it is actually resulting in much more robust resilience. That is to say, instead of not seeing the attack or polarization and so on, people learn to identify these as, robots, trolls, and things like that. But you do not need to censor them. People can have a shared understanding of what is actually going on and then contribute really ideas and creative solutions, turning the conflicts not into, fires to be put out, but rather co-creative sources of energy. Right. And so that is our position and the position that I share in the cybersecurity conference. And so to your other question about the role social media plays today. So I'm advising the Project Liberty Institute, and we're redesigning the ideas around communities online so that we can build upon what's called open source or free software, decentralized systems, so that if you are not happy with any particular policy that a social media runs, you can keep your content, keep your relationship, keep your social graph, and then just migrate to some other communities where you can then have your own conversation and moderation rules. And so we're advising also the team about the People's Bid, trying to buy TikTok with Frank McCord and O'Leary leading the bid to turn TikTok into something like this, where the moderation rules are not determined by a far-off entity, but rather by individual communities.
So how would your system differ from a system like Facebook's fact checkers or what now is described as the X community note system? Because some people have argued, and we have seen this firsthand, how these systems, while they have come with good intentions, originally kind of like this idea that it's going to be a collaborative effort with people identifying things that are obvious lies or misinformation or, putting in their input, they've also been weaponized, right? We've seen the way that Facebook or Meta has created partisan advisory boards full of mostly like leftist activists, for example, that weaponized the fact-checking system and used it to impose fake science or revisionist history. And some people have also made the same argument for the community note system on X, arguing that there's only a select few people who can actually participate in the community note system, which means that it's not as open source or as decentralized or open to the public as it may, try to portray itself as being. So how would you say that your system of doing things is different from Meta's fact checkers or Facebook's community note or X's community notes, excuse me?
Yeah, in two very important ways. One is that we're replacing top-down decisions with a community-based bottom-up approach. And so instead of a secret panels where you really do not know who they are, deciding who to silence, the idea is that each community can decide what content they value. And so this is the first thing. It's basically decentralizing the decision-making, not just the technical apparatus. And the second thing is that it is based on more speech instead of less speech. The idea of our system is that you simply see more labels, like what ideas are gaining common ground in your communities and what ideas remain divisive, but how it is debated. But these labels are not taking anything down. You're simply given more context about who supports it and why. And so that is the opposite of censorship. We're not taking anything down. We're adding in valuable context.
And so, given what you just said, how was your own reaction to J.D. Vance's speech? Did you find yourself agreeing with most of what he said, or did you find yourself disagreeing with elements of it, or do you agree that we've seen like a degradation and kind of an assault on free speech and freedom of expression in Europe?
Well, I think the Romania case that he basically shares with the audience, that is also a case that I often make, which is we need to strengthen democracy so it is not easily overtaken or overwhelmed by bots, by polarization attacks from authoritarian regimes. So in that message, I think we're very much in sync. I think many of the European audience basically are trying to come up with what we have already discovered in Taiwan, which is a more robust, a more open and transparent way of basically making sure that people understand what's going on. Additional context is actually better in terms of defending against such polarization and infiltration attacks, troll attacks, and so on, than misclassifying some humans as trolls and then therefore silencing their speech. And because in doing so, then you weaken the social fabric, you weaken the strengths of different people with different opinions. And so I think the Vance speech outlines a direction. And then I think the technological idea here is that we need to make sure that the communities have the moderation in their own hands instead of just making sure that one single state actor or one single big tech actor does that, because as long as it's centralized in one decision maker, I think this false trade-off will inevitably happen.
You mentioned the sunflower movement in Taiwan. And so I wanted to get your take on this, because what we saw here in the United States was a crackdown on free speech and a movement to increase censorship here in the United States when we had our own January 6th protests at the United States Capitol. Now, the left would argue that they were violent. The right would say that they were peaceful protests, given the fact that, you know, nobody used any weapons and they were just Trump supporters simply occupying what we call here the People's House, right? The United States Capitol, which is paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. But that was the catalyst. That was the defining moment that really resulted in the deplatforming of Donald Trump and the creation of new pro-censorship policies by the big tech social media companies here in America to not only silence world leaders, but also silence half of the country and really crack down on political speech. Did you see similar things happen when you had the occupation of your own government buildings in Taiwan during the sunflower movement? Because it's interesting to see how all around the world, right, there have been protest movements where citizens have occupied political buildings, and yet the reactions have been so drastic. I mean, here in the United States, you had politicians like Kamala Harris actually saying that January 6th was worse than Pearl Harbor or worse than 9/11, right? When thousands of people lost their lives in acts of terrorism. And so how would you compare and contrast something like Taiwan's sunflower movement to the January 6th protests at the United States Capitol?
Well, back in 2014, I believe that we were even more divided and angry. The approval rate at the time was 9% for the president at the time. That is to say, in a country with 24 million people, anything that the president says, like 20 million people against him. And so I think that was even more drastic. I think one contrast I will draw is that we said in the beginning that we're not just demanding something or protesting something. Rather, we're from the demand side moving to the supply side, the tech support side, by demonstrating that it is possible for people to come up with better trade deal policy ideas instead of just the one that's being rammed through, or that people can come up with better thoughts around how to protect our information ecosystem from the invasions, right, of communist authoritarian ideas and so on. And so by very quickly positioning ourselves into demonstrators, not just protesters. I think that is how the energy has been different and resulted in Sunflower being one of the very rare Occupy that resulted in the Speaker of the Parliament basically said, okay, the people's idea do have a point, let's accept their ideas. And so that was the Occupy that converged instead of diverged over time.
You have a paper that you published, Understanding Over Engagement, Designing Platforms to Bring Us Together, where you talk about how we need to be focused on creating these platforms and supporting the creation of social media platforms to support communities and build up communities and freedom of speech, but also to combat authoritarianism. Do you feel that now more than ever, or perhaps, we're seeing a decrease in authoritarianism, but is it your opinion that with the rise of technology, we're seeing an increased threat of global authoritarianism or a decreased threat of global authoritarianism?
Yeah, I think for authoritarians, their main idea really is to spread this freedom only leads to chaos, freedom only leads to infighting, freedom never leads to something that delivers. That meta-narrative really is their justification for locking down and shutting down and taking down stuff, right? So to combat that, what we need is to build a resilient society that, for example, if you subscribe to content that supports traditional values and you see a post that's labeled like it's a shared ground among Christian conservatives and so on, and then you see some very trollish attacks from maybe a libertarian angle and so on. And so that's when the sowing of discord happens in those polarization attacks. So nowadays, the tactics from authoritarians is no longer taking down things, but rather populating it with even more message that creates this false sense of consensus, like, oh, there's so much infighting and chaos. But with our system, you can see a very clear label that this is a shared ground. And there's also different perspectives among libertarians and so on.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, because what we're seeing now is echo chambers. And even though I would say that X has, I've been censored on Twitter 1.0, and I've also been censored on Twitter 2.0. So I've been censored by Jack Dorsey and I've been censored by Elon Musk. But one thing that you said in your paper that I found to be really interesting is you said, with a deeply polarizing U.S. election fresh in mind, the need to redesign platforms that bridge divides has never been more urgent. In a paper we've just released, we offer a solution based on one that has already played a pivotal role in addressing similar problems in Taiwan and on X. And you're right. What's happened now is that even though I would say there's more free speech on Twitter 2.0 than we saw on Twitter 1.0, you have echo chambers where you have people on the left, because of the polarizing election and because Elon Musk gave $270 million to support the presidential election in support of Donald Trump. They're now all flocking to Blue Sky, where if you're a conservative like I am and you're, going on Blue Sky, you're barely going to have an audience, because, it seems like social media now has divided itself into these echo chambers. X, of course, I think picked up a lot of support, especially in the aftermath of Meta censoring so many people during the election. But now you're seeing this rebrand effort, whether it's genuine or not, by Mark Zuckerberg to try to rebrand Meta. But you talk about how, what if instead, this is another quote from your paper, instead of amplifying posts that spread misinformation or fuel outrage and division, social media platforms empower their users to promote content that they value and that brings their communities together? What if instead of leaving content moderation to censorial governments or the political whims of tech billionaires, platforms allowed users to provide context that fosters understanding and strengthens their communities? It's an interesting concept, because we have seen this accusation from the left. They'll say things like, oh, Elon Musk simply amplifies content that's like fuel outrage or rage bait for the conservative movement. But then you'll see people say the opposite, right? If you're on they said the same thing about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook when Facebook was largely controlled by leftists. And so do you find that if we were to have this content moderation system where it was not up to tech billionaires or governments to decide what terms of service should be, like we're seeing with the European Union now in their attacks on free speech and the way that they're trying to create this, I guess you would say, like a European Union standard for how content should be moderated, I feel like we would have more peaceful discourse online, and there would probably be less social animus and less hostility and less political divisions if people felt like neither political ideology was being over amplified. What's your opinion of this? Because I think that we've all found ourselves on both sides of the aisle. Certainly, like pre-Twitter 2.0, I found myself accusing big tech social media companies of being more left-leaning. And even now, right, I find myself criticizing and often questioning the amount of power and influence that tech billionaires have, because I still find myself censored even though Trump is president.
Yeah, and I have just registered on Truth Social. My first post was reposting you. And I do feel that it has a much more of a community spirit where users do feel they have more control and less likely actually to abandon the platform when they don't feel that the decision making and sensorial decisions and so on are managed by one person or a few persons, right? So I think that fosters genuine community conversations. And so I think the main technical question we're facing is whether this individual platforms such as True Social, which is, by the way, free software, open source, and Blue Sky, also free software, open source, whether it is possible to build relevant bridges so that it is not just the community nodes, which already happens after something that is very polarizing, very angry, went viral, right? So how about community posts, not just community notes, and that you can post on your own communities on either True Social, Blue Sky, or other open source communities, but then you then also have this additional label that does show that it is a common ground across all those different smaller platforms. And that, I think, will give the people much more control and much more understanding of each other beyond the models that is prototyped by Meta or X at this point.
So what is the best way to do that? Because I know you've talked about this idea, right? It's a concept that sounds ideal, right? This idea that people would have a community partnership in deciding what is true information, what is disinformation. But it still seems, as you just said, that these systems that have been created by X or have been created by Meta are still not ideal because they still find themselves, being influenced, in my opinion, at least, by the political ideology. I often find myself wondering, like, who the hell is in control of community notes or who's in control of fact checking? Because sometimes I see these community notes or fact checks and they are just as absurd as the claims being made.
Yeah, and over and over again, we have seen that it is currently in the advertisement fueled models. Only the advertisers, and especially very big advertisers, get to see the social fabric. The people who voted for, liked the same content, people who share similar content and so on. But that information is not made available to individual people. It is just made to the people who basically make the individualized advertisements so that it even derails us from the shared common experience even more because everybody was seeing different precision targeting of advertisements. So part of the paper is to imagine a different funding model where the communities can fund shared common experiences so that people think of the shared posts that bring the different communities together. Like in the example I just gave, if there's a post or there's a piece of video that could explain the more conservative angle to the libertarians and so on. And then for people who belong in both community to have a way to bring those together so that this is what we call pre-bunking. Instead of debunking after the fact, we can have shared narratives before something that is fueled by hate or outrage happens. And again, it doesn't require censorship at all. It just requires building more bridge-making content. And so if people are interested in learning more about the People's Bid, the peoplesbid.com has this ideas laid out on how it could be applied to TikTok if, of course, the People's Bid won the bid. But for the underlying ideas, there's also a book, plurality.net, that I co-wrote with 60 other people. And it's free software. Oh, here you go. Yeah, it's in the public domain. So there's no copyright. Feel free to remix as you want.
Yeah, I have your book. And then you also have a film coming out as well in 2 weeks. So what can you tell us about your film?
Sure, it's called Good Enough Ancestor, and it tells the story of Taiwan's democratization because I was born into a family of journalists. My parents are both journalists, and they had to work within the martial law era's rules, which is very censorial. And by the time we really democratized, 1996, when we had our first presidential election, that is already the time of the browsers, of the World Wide Web, and so on. So from the very beginning, internet freedom and our democratic freedom, both are the same thing in Taiwan. And so we innovated a lot on how to defend our democracies without sacrificing our freedom. Because even though our own martial law era is over, there's still authoritarian neighbors to Taiwan from Beijing that still want to push this authoritarian agenda.
Enough ancestors. So we're just getting that loaded up momentarily, and we'll play it. Here's another quote from your paper. You said, instead of removing or shadow banning controversial content, platforms should empower participants to help offer meaningful context. This could include clearly showing which communities embrace certain views or watch certain videos and labeling content as shared ground when it reflects widely accepted perspectives or different perspectives when it's more controversial. And so how would you or I guess I should say, where would you draw the line? Because here in America, right, you have people that argue that certain content is hate speech, even though there's no such thing as hate speech because there's no hate speech exemption as it relates to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And so it's very subjective, and it's become very political and partisan in nature because you have people who now have a distorted understanding of what the First Amendment means and the grounds of the First Amendment. And there is this widely held view that there is such thing as hate speech, even though, according to the United States Supreme Court, there's no such thing as hate speech. Now, the First Amendment does not protect incitement to violence or terroristic threats, but where would you draw the line as it relates to this system of creating shared ground policies for content moderation? Would you allow for things like, for example, things that would automatically get you banned on social media, like child porn, or things like terroristic threats or support for groups like ISIS? Would this system allow for things like that to exist, but with extreme social pressure so that the moderation would signal to society that this content is wrong or it's shameful or something that should not be tolerated? Or would this system, given the fact that you're aiming for total decentralization, would it completely ban or silence content like that?
Yeah, so I was also in Paris for the AI Action Summit, where we launched the Roost, the robust open online safety tools. And part of the Roost idea is that the defense against these attacks that are clearly unlawful should be open source and decentralized as well. So, for example, the child sexual abuse material that you mentioned is illegal to host. Right, so this is not a matter of lawful or awful speech. This is basically illegal content. And for that, currently, we also rely on the largest of the big tech to tell like whether that is decent material or not. Not only do small operators have to pay a very large amount of licensing fee, if there's errors in the judgment, there is really no way to appeal outside of the existing big tech ways. And so the idea of Roost is to, again, decentralize so that even small-time hosters of content can very easily automatically detect such unlawful content. And so it doesn't require the community vote even, but if you want to tune, you want to update and so on, you can do so without violating either some NDA with big tech or violating any law. So I think the free expression is required, but underneath that, we need the robust online safety tools that detects unlawful, not just awful content. So not awful content at all, but just unlawful content, and can do so in a way that makes sure that the smaller operators can remain economic to run. But above that level, anything that is lawful, I do feel that we need to have both the fierce support for free expression and a practical method for communities to own the moderation tools so that the algorithmic manipulation cannot make the false virality of the like faked polarization that wasn't there, but it was just one idea that was amplified because of the polarization attacks. But to do that, we don't need to censor anything. All we need is to share with communities a way to shape their own social media reality. Again, by making sure there's a freedom first way to label something as shared ground, and therefore people can have a conversation based on the shared grounds, and something that is truly divisive, but represents balanced views of both sides of the divide, instead of falsely thinking that one very extreme take is all there it is.
And you talk about a lot of this in your book, Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy. So I would encourage that people check it out. But we also have a trailer for your film. And so just before we play the trailer for Good Enough Ancestor, I wanted to just give you a moment to tell the viewers what inspired you to make this film, when it comes out, and why people should watch the film.
Sure. So I think the message here is that technology must advance freedom, something that we really believe in Taiwan. And we believe that America can also make this vision, amplify this vision, a reality, so that people do not need to trade off between freedom on one side and safety or security on the other, but rather using technology to enhance freedom in a way that puts the steering wheel, puts the reins into the hands of individuals and communities.
Let me go ahead and play the trailer for the film.
Across the world, democracy is on a decline.
Authoritarianism is on the rise.
Global freedom has eroded for the 18th consecutive year.
Audrey TANG, what is your greatest hope for democracy across the globe?
That people see democracy as a social technology, something that people can construct together, that they can improve in the here and now. We can code up political systems.
The Sunflower Movement was a real turning point for Taiwan's democracy.
When the Sunflower Movement happened, I said to my colleague, I have to leave now. Democracy needs me. I brought a very long cable for internet connection. I live streamed through Twitter. Everybody saw it is possible for democracy to evolve, to come up with novel policies simply by asking the people, what should we do together? I was born with a heart defect, and one day I just fainted. I woke up in a hospital, and they told me the hole in my heart has grown. I could die. This awareness that everything can be reset tomorrow reminds me of Taiwanese democracy. We can't lose our democracy just with a couple missiles.
I think there's a lot that the world can learn from Taiwan. The US is running on a 250-year-old operating system. There's a strong desire to move beyond this and properly rethink from first principles. What would democracy in the 21st century actually look like?
We can make the government more open to the public. It'll be easier for people to access the data, to analyze it, transparency.
Audrey has created the opportunity to make Taiwan the most exciting constitutional democracy in the world.
I think it's a very critical moment. China really wants to invade Taiwan.
You're sitting on a place that is the flashpoint if there's going to be World War III. And yet there's calm in the eye of the hurricane. And that calm, I think, emanates from all that Audrey's done.
We can become co-creators of our democratic system, reconfiguring society in a way that is more transparent, more inclusive, more fair.
Very nice trailer there. When is the official release date for people who want to watch it, and when can people watch it?
Well, I think it's March 9th, and I'll be posting on, Truth Social and X.com and Blue Sky and the usual places.
Wonderful. And one thing I want to ask you, and it's a personal question, but so you don't have to answer, but hopefully you will answer the question. But we've seen that a lot of the social moderation and a lot of the efforts to censor content online has been driven by the woke left, at least here in America. And some of the people and some of the groups that have been behind a lot of the censorship on these social media platforms have done so at the request of LGBTQ organizations. And what I find to be rather interesting about you is that not only are you Taiwan's first digital minister, but you're the world's first also transgender minister. And so given the fact that, so many people in the LGBT community have pushed for censorship in terms of like advocating for censorship of language or content that they think is disrespectful to the trans movement or the, LGBTQ movement, what kind of attacks have you received personally from individuals in that community who maybe have accused you of, like fostering a community of hate simply because you are, it seems to be, pushing for true free speech absolutism, which also means allowing for people to say things that may be offensive to you?
Well, I mean, I was born with the condition of very low testosterone. So it is true that I am somewhat between naturally, but I've never let that bother me. So my pronouns are whatever. If people use any pronouns, I mean, in Taiwan, we say ta, 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 doesn't really matter. And so in my mind, there really is no such forced language changes that is needed for addressing me. So my pronouns are officially whatever. Now, to your more serious question, I do think the absolute freedom of speech and mutual respect can coexist. The main problem was that in the broadcast-based social media, only the most viral ideas or the viral takes gets viral. And then people do not actually think that there's the other common sense, middle ground ideas that could have bridged the different communities together in kind of mutual respect. And so each side caricatured the other side as the worst version of that side, and therefore makes it much harder then to have common sense conversations.
And so do you ever find yourself receiving attacks for being a free speech absolutist or attacks from within, certain communities for advocating for, true free speech? Because we have seen there are efforts, especially within the algorithms, as you're mentioning, this algorithmic manipulation to silence and censor certain people based off their use of certain words or what some people would call slurs, right? Like anti-gay or anti-transgender or racist slurs. And so what kind of challenges have you faced personally from people in the free speech or technology community for your perseverance and also your dedication to having true free speech? Because we see a lot of people out there like to claim that they are for free speech, but there's always a caveat, right? Like people sometimes censor whether you offend them. Like we're told that X is truly a free speech platform, but many people found themselves being censored by Elon Musk because they simply got in a heated argument with him about H-1B visas or had a disagreement with him. And so while there's claims and accusations and statements made by a lot of people that they truly are 100% pro free speech, we always see that there's a little disclaimer there. So I just wondered if you've been attacked personally for promoting free speech absolutism and total decentralization and this approach to, shared ground moderation, given, your own personal background.
Yeah, and as we speak, I think there's a very robust conversation going on in the Rumble chat room, which I'm reading. And I think it's really good that we then have ways to directly address people's questions, right?
Oh, yeah, we can go to the chat too. Let's go to the chat and we can. Audrey loves questions.
Yes, people are commenting, for example, that my pronouns are whatever, so they find it interesting. There's people who ask my support for safe spaces for women. Of course, I've always supported that. And so I think it is quite important that we have this direct conversation, because only direct conversations can build true bridges. If people only read like one snapshot, one clip from the other, then those awful but lawful speeches may look like representing entire communities, but there's no real dialogue. So my answer to your direct question is that I do believe free speech is not just a speech to broadcast. It is also about broad listening. It is also about the freedom to listen across differences and then respond in real time. And if we have that freedom, then it's much harder to caricature the other side. And then it's basically easier then to resolve some of the tensions and some of the, people's ideologies who then ask them to, draw intolerant conclusions and so on. So I think the fact that we have the chat here is a proof that absolute free speech and real-time response actually works better when we want to communicate around such things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just saying that I do find it to be admirable, because you see a lot of big talk from people in the space who, they say that they truly support free speech, but as soon as you say something that, goes against their personal views or their, personal preferences or their political ideology, you learn very quickly that they're not for free speech. I want to go to the chat and take a few questions, because Audrey did say that she wants to answer a lot of questions. So let's scroll up. Early GX said, "Thank you, Audrey, for finding solutions to end censorship." Let's see. If you have questions, be sure to post your questions, because Audrey wants to answer them. Let's see. There's a lot of comments, not necessarily questions, but there's a debate that's happening in the chat about whether AI needs to be regulated. Do you support the regulation of AI? And given the growing influence of AI, and you even see the Trump administration creating an AI czar, right? Having an entire AI department now and focus within the Trump administration to become the world's leader in AI and also cryptocurrency. What are your views on the growing advancements in AI technology, and how do you feel about AI regulation?
Yeah, again, it's just like asking, what do I feel about community moderation? And my answer is exactly the same. If it's in the hands of people and individual communities and families, then it's a good thing, because people can steer it however they want. If it is just in the hands of one or two persons, then that may not be the best idea, because then it ends up being one or two people determining the worldview of the entire society. It would be aligning the society to the logic, just like in social media algorithms, the logic of the creator of such algorithms, instead of aligning this tool to people's uses. So as I mentioned, the Roost, the robust open online safety tools, is a set of AI models. It is basically to safeguard against illegal material and so on. But the great thing about open source and free software is that people can tune it to their community's liking. So if your community have different standards for moderation and so on, that AI should be tuned and tamed, domesticated by your community, not by some place that's very far, either in Silicon Valley or somewhere else in Beijing, and you have no control over. So my answer is that AI becomes assistive, augmenting, only if we control the tuning of AI and the domestication of AI, so that it suits our own purposes, not some abstract big text purposes.
Yeah. Let's go to the chat again. A couple more questions. You scroll down. Let's see. Flydog777 said, well, there's two questions here. How would we legislate a mandate or law to embolden this? And then Marnie has a question. She says, what are steps we can take to support this?
Yeah, that's both great questions. So in Taiwan, for example, we sent 200,000 SMS text messages from the official number 111 to ask random Taiwanese citizens what to do about the trolls, the deepfakes, the attack on information integrity online. And people share their ideas. And then we basically asked people to volunteer like a jury. So 450 people randomly selected, representing statistically Taiwan, came up on these online conversations in rooms of 10 people each. 45 rooms had this conversation. And people definitely said, for example, that you should not be able to use money to buy this trollish influence that impersonates celebrities and get the celebrities to put words in their mouths that they have never said and so on. Those deepfake ads need to go. But we need to do that without censoring anyone. So how do we do that? So the people's idea is that if it is, for example, Audrey Tang's advertisement selling you something, then it needs to secure a digital signature from Audrey Tang saying that I endorse this message. That's it. So if Facebook, for example, does not secure my signature and somebody gets scammed out of $2 million, then starting this year, Facebook in Taiwan is liable for that $2 million. So this fraud, scams, financial damage can be combated in a way that does not have censorship as its side effect, but rather can simply require people who pay the money to digitally sign. So that, I think, the Anti-Fraud Act is a very sensible piece of legislation that I hope other jurisdictions would consider, but also the idea of coming up with such pro-freedom, not censorship solutions. That is also something that the governments around the world can engage people more. So as for like concrete ways to support this, I think the ideas of a decentralized social media is still pretty new. So spread that idea. You can find many of those policies, ideas, and thoughts in the plurality.net book.
And so the concept then of a digital signature, that would only then apply to advertisements to prevent scams. But how would you then go about, I mean, that doesn't necessarily address like what some people would call trolls, because a lot of like memes could be considered trollish. And so how do you go about that without censoring? Because some people would say that a meme is a troll, and then some people would say that a troll is a meme. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Like it's all about your interpretation, or I guess like if you're on the receiving end of the meme or you're just an observer, because some people would say that like actual commentary or satire or real memes, artistic expression could be trolls, but then others would see it differently.
Yeah, and so to go back to the Romania example that your vice president brought up in Munich, I think what happened there is not a simple meme, but rather some way for one person to control thousands of accounts, and as if there's like thousands of different people having different political views and so on, and then just trolling together. And so I think the idea here is not to censor ever on content, but rather on the actor. So if there's a foreign actor basically pretending to be 5,000 American people, that should be detected as soon as possible. And you can do it in a way that does not compromise privacy at all. In Taiwan, we have this idea of decentralized wallet, and it's an infrastructure that allow people to digitally sign, but without revealing any personal details. So I can sign saying that I'm a Taiwanese resident, or even that I'm a resident of Taipei City, if it's a discussion about the city budget, but it does not reveal my name, where I live, my social security number, or really anything else. So this idea of selective disclosure to let people prove that it is just one person behind it, to make it impossible for a foreign actor to control 5 million accounts, I think that is also the sort of infrastructure that we need to support together.
So how would I guess if you could provide an answer then to the question that was asked is how would people go about legislating this? Because our system here is a bit different. And of course you have, Congress and you have lawmakers and they have to draft up a bill and they have to get support and they have to take a vote for this bill on the floor of the House and then get approval in the Senate. And then of course the bill goes to the desk of the president. So how, given our system here in the United States of America, do you foresee citizens going about getting something like this legislated?
Well, first of all, I think if something is shown to be technically possible and even preferred, then people will then put the pressure on the legislators to make it happen. And so one idea that I have is to make them interoperable like the Type-C connectors. So I think one of the good things that the European Union did is to basically say that you must use the same standard for connectors without saying that which company makes the connectors. And so they have this Type-C idea that we're all benefiting from. So we're not, compelled to buy like 5 sorts of micro USB Lightning or whatever chargers. So imagine the same, but for social media. So that instead of Meta or X basically hoarding all the content, if you want to view such content on True Social or on Blue Sky or some other smaller experiences, then you can freely do so. They cannot close the fire hose. They cannot close the speech from being displayed in smaller communities. I think that is also something, the interoperability, as we say, is something that's also worth fighting for, because again, it emboldens free speech. It makes it much harder for a larger platform to censor stuff. So if you're interested in this idea, there's some policy blueprints about that. You can find it in Project Liberty. The Project Liberty Institute, I also advise, I'm a senior fellow there, have such policy packages. And the hope is that if we try it out in the TikTok people's bid, if we get the bid from the McCord O'Leary bid, or we can also try it in smaller places like True Social or Blue Sky. And once people see that it's really working well, then it transfers into legislative action.
And then going along, just to kind of like pick your brain, I guess, on as it relates to authoritarianism, aside from the obvious, which is the CCP, and we've talked about that extensively here on Loomer Unleashed, what do you think right now is the biggest global authoritarian threat, especially as it relates to censorship and technology? I mean, we've seen the threat of China, and given your position as the cyber ambassador in Taiwan, I'm sure you're constantly worried about the threat of Chinese occupation and the threat of the CCP. But aside from the CCP and threats from Xi Jinping, what is the greatest global threat of authoritarianism right now?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the authoritarian narrative is not just about censorship. It is about pushing the meta narrative that says freedom only leads to chaos. Freedom only leads to infighting. And this is also some, as you said, it's hard to tell a troll from a meme, right? So even though it may not be specifically CCP actors saying this, there's also people repeating this meme in freedom-loving countries and basically giving up hope that absolute freedom of speech, of expression, of assembly, and so on can coexist with mutual understanding. And so if we make this meme viral, if we say technology must advance freedom and freedom can lead to shared understanding, then that's a very powerful countermeasure, a counter narrative to this narrative that says, oh, freedom only leads to infighting. Look at America, right? So I think we can all participate in this counter narrative.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on my show tonight, and thank you so much for answering so many questions. We have a lot more questions, but you'll have to come on again, and hopefully people will read your book, Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy, and then also your very exciting film, Good Enough Ancestor. I believe you said it comes out on March 9th. Where are people going to be able to watch that film?
Well, I'll share it on True Social. My handle is Audrey TANG there. I'm going to share it on x.com. My handle is Audrey T there, and also on Blue Sky.
Wonderful. And aside from those social media handles, where else can people follow you and your work?
Well, I think most of all, I would like to invite people to follow the Plurality work. So on plurality.net, you will find our Discord channel. Feel free to drop into the chat, so on and so forth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for, speaking out about these issues and the work that you're doing to fight for free speech and breach these subjects about censorship and authoritarianism and collaborative communication for the preservation of democracy on an international stage. I find it to be really interesting. And of course, I've been reading the book and reading your papers, and I'm really looking forward to watching your movie when it comes out.
Well, thank you. And thank you, people in the chat room, for being civil. And I see just now FlyDog777 says that it was informative and interesting. So that makes me really happy. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, we have a lot of people on Rumble, but then we also have, let's see how many people on X, because I stream the show on X and Rumble. So I don't know how many viewers we have right now on Rumble, but we have 60,000, 60. So
Wow.
60,000 live viewers right now on X. So hopefully everybody watching finds it to be rather informative. So be sure that if you're watching right now, that you repost the live link on X and Rumble, and also be sure that you follow Audrey on X and True Social. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Thank you.